Yeah, all you do is just hit the next one, but you can look up there and whenever, because it shows a couple of verses. Yep. So just when you see it up there. All right. We'll start in chapter 3, verse 1, and we'll read through the whole chapter. It says, Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, All that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. For you have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, How did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Thank you, Isaiah. Okay. All right. I'm going to come back to the opening. So I don't know if you guys have noticed at all, but for the first, we didn't have the slides every week, but I had the idea of Ruth and then God's sovereign redeeming grace as kind of the idea behind this whole thing. And as I was thinking through that, obviously, and Al would be happy with this because he kept saying, this is a love story. This is a love story, and he's right. It is a love story. And so I changed it to the word love. And the other part of that is the reason, a reason behind that is because we've talked about God's hesed, his love, his covenant love. And that's all throughout the book of Ruth. And so I want to change that. So it's God's sovereign and redeeming love. But with that idea too, hesed, or his covenant love, really encapsulates all of his character. It encapsulates his grace, his mercy, his compassion, his faithfulness, and his love. And so we could almost say that we're looking at his hesed throughout this whole thing. And in the first 5 verses, where we saw, Naomi and Elimelech and their sons go away from God, we could see God's mercy in that first section. That was kind of the focal point. And then we saw God's, mercy through that whole bringing them back. Then we saw his grace poured out last week. That was the illustration there with the dog food bag, and all of that was just grace poured out and out, again and again, and his compassion for them. And so now, as we're getting into this portion, his love is really becoming the focal point. And of course, and again, it is this love story, right, that's kind of unfolding. But ultimately, it is a love story, but the love story that's here isn't so much about Boaz and Ruth as much as it is about God and his pursuing Naomi, those who had wandered off, and also Ruth, those who were far off. And so this is a love story really about God and his love for us and his pursuing and redeeming us. So as we left off with chapter 2, the idea there at the end of chapter 2, and I'm going to just try to figure out where I'm putting everything here. At the end of chapter 2, we saw in chapter 1 that Naomi was coming back and that she was there was this idea that she was turning back to God, but ultimately there was still bitterness, right? She was very clear about that. Call me Mara. I'm not pleasant. My life isn't pleasant. God's hand is against me. That was the end of chapter 1. And at the end of chapter 2, as Ruth went out and took initiative to care for her mother-in-law, we saw Naomi's heart start to soften at the very end of that, when she, had kind of just said, fine, you can go glean if you want to. But at the end, she said, she calls her my daughter and says, go be careful. I want you to be cautious as you go. And so now as we get into chapter 3, we're going to really see Naomi's heart changing, because now, as we open up here, she is pursuing rest. She's seeking rest for Ruth. And if you guys remember, and I didn't put this up here, but remember in chapter 1, and I'm saying chapter 1, this is a story, right? We're referring to it as chapters and verses, but this is a life story. This is a real thing that's happened. But back when they were journeying back from Moab, remember she told Ruth and Orpah, she's like, go back. You'll find rest there. And she prayed that God would give them rest there, but she really sent them back, like, go back to your people, to your family, to your gods, and find rest there. And it was really her just kind of saying, go back there. I obviously, my God's not working for our favor. You're better off there. Just go. And really left them to themselves, like, you'll be better off there. Now there's a difference. It's, should I not be the one to actually put effort in and seek rest for you and find rest for you? So there's certainly a change of heart here for Naomi. And again, we referenced this before, and again, I didn't put this in my notes here, but as she sends her back and says this idea of, like, finding rest, again, if you write down in your own notes to look up later, Hebrews 4, 1 through 11, it's a whole section talking about rest, the rest that was pursued. And Israel was promised rest when they would come into the land. And as they came into the land of Israel, never really found rest. And they ultimately never found it, because that rest is ultimately found in Christ. And ultimately will be when he comes to make all things new. But this is that type of rest. She's seeking rest for Ruth. And so we see a change of heart in Naomi, in her heart towards Ruth and her heart towards God. But not just a general change of heart, because again, she is now coming up with this plan, and she sends her out, and I'll just we'll go over this briefly. But she's like, isn't he out there winnowing barley tonight? And again, not to go into this too far, you can look it up. It's neat to kind of learn about how these things are done. But essentially, they would find they would take all that they've gathered. Remember, they had the whole gathering season. They would take all of that, and they would go to a hilltop somewhere where the wind would blow. And of course, you've probably heard this if you've thought through Psalm 1, when he talks about the wicked are blown away like the chaff, right? And so you throw it all up, and all the heavy seed falls, and all the chaff blows away. And that's what they were doing. They were up there and they were just throwing all this stuff and letting the wind take it. And so when they would do that, they would go out to this location, a further location where they could get the wind to do that, and they would just stay. They would camp out there. And so Naomi, she's not just like, I'm going to seek rest for you. She's like, I've got a plan. It's thought out. This is going to happen. Boaz is going to stay the night there. So you're going to go while he's there. And then, of course, what was it, a few weeks ago, Caleb had asked, we had some questions about Ruth. What are your questions? And he's like, what did you say? What was your question? Is Ruth a creep, I think? Because the idea is what? It's for her to go, like, hey, he's going to be out here. He's going to be spending the night. I want you to go, wash yourself, anoint yourself, change the clothes that you have. And there is an idea here, maybe that her clothes were still clothes of mourning. We don't really know. But either way, he tells her to go and do these things. And then to go make herself known to the man. But to wait until he's finished drinking and eating so that his heart is merry. And let's see here. Yeah, then just observe the place where he goes, and he'll go and uncover his feet, lie down, and he'll tell you what to do. So it's a very thought out plan. It's a very shrewd plan. There's a lot of interesting things here as we looked it up. It's like, okay, was there like biblical basis for this? And it's kind of half and half. Some people are like, maybe this was a normal practice that we just didn't know about. But for most people, you look at it and go, this doesn't seem normal. This doesn't seem like a really, like a godly plan. I will say at least this, and for the guys here, or girls, whatever, there's things that are descriptive in Scripture and things that are prescriptive. This is not a prescriptive thing. This isn't a, hey, this is how you should go get somebody. This is just a description of what happened in this instance, and we don't even know for sure if it was really that God was leading her in giving this plan. The point we should take from this is that Naomi had gotten beyond the point of just this depression that she was in last week we talked about, right? Where she just was unable to move forward. Ruth had to do everything. Now Naomi is at least thinking through, I want to work, for your good. I want to try to help you to find rest, and here's a way to do it. The other thing, though, I want to notice here is because she has all this plan laid out. I want you to go do all these things, change your clothes, do all these things, go there to where he lies down, lay down there at his feet, and then he's going to tell you what to do. It's not like Naomi had talked to Boaz and had a plan with him. At this point, what she's saying is, yes, I said the name weird. Go there, lay at his feet, and then ultimately you're going to have to trust God, right? And that's a wonderful thing to see Naomi saying, because it just references and shows for us that she is starting to trust God again, because she's sending Ruth into this place, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. It's a very vulnerable position for Ruth to be in, and Naomi's sending her there, and she's saying to her, "Go and then just trust. You'll know what to do next." And so what a wonderful thing to see Naomi's heart changing, and that she's relying on God. I wanted to share some. This was a quote that I thought just really encapsulated this well, because Naomi, as we've talked about, and Ruth are seeing God's hand moving in their life. Naomi was a little blind to it at first in her bitterness, right? But she's opening up and she's saying, no, God, you were working for my good this whole time. I can see that now. Ruth seems to have seen it clearly as someone who didn't even know Yahweh. But knowing God's sovereignty is, I think, exactly what is allowing Naomi to act in this way. Barry Webb says this. He says, properly understood, a belief in God's sovereignty does not lead to fatalism or passivity. Quite the contrary, it provides hope and the confidence to move forward. And we can see that in Naomi's life right here, because she's saying, God, you're working for my good. I can see that now. And because I know you're working for my good, I can send Ruth into this situation that is a vulnerable situation, because ultimately you're the one working. And so understanding God's sovereignty doesn't cause us to step back and go, oh, God will do it, so I don't need to do anything. If anything, God's sovereignty then gives us confidence to move on. And there's other places you can see that just for note. And actually, you know what? I do have it here. We'll reference it quickly. In Acts, we saw this with the Apostle Paul. Because the Apostle Paul, when he was in Corinth, God appeared to him. Paul was apparently burdened and fearful. And the Lord came to him and says, don't be afraid. Go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in the city who are my people. And the idea, and the reason I'm sharing this, is because this was an instance where God, there was no one who had come to faith yet. But God revealed to him, there are many who are going to come. I'm in control. And so you don't have to be fearful. You can go share the gospel because I'm sovereign over all things. And so in the same way, what we see here with Naomi is that knowing that God was working for her good, which has been evident in her life so far, gave her confidence to send Ruth to Boaz. Now, it's good. It's good to see Naomi pursuing rest for Ruth, but this does do something else. Oh, and I had that up there. Is it presents a risk for Ruth. And so in these next verses, well, she lays out this plan for her, right? Naomi lays out this plan and says, this is what I want you to do. Ruth's response is amazing, because it's like, hey, I want you to go do all these things. Go lay at this guy's feet and just trust. It's going to go well. Trust me. And she's like, all that you say, I will do. Right? Her loyalty to Naomi is incredible. It's on display here. But also, I think that just like Naomi, Ruth is able to say this because she's seen that God is faithful. Right? She's seen that He's moving, so she's able to say these things, and she's able not just to say I'll do it, but then to actually act on it. And of course, acting on faith is the harder part of faith, right? To say I believe, God, that you're working for my good is fine. To go and act on that belief is a whole other thing. I was going to show a video and I couldn't get it to load up on here, and I don't know if I should anyway, but I thought, illustrations are helpful sometimes, especially if the kids are falling asleep or whatever. But there's the trust exercises, right? Like they do this all over the place. They do it in businesses and whatever. I watched one where they had, the trust fall, right? And it's like, just fall. And it's like, do you trust us? Oh yeah, I trust you. Okay, well then do it. It's like, and then all of a sudden like, well, so you don't really trust us, right? And of course this one, they did it, and it was, I think, in a part of a church, and they had him get up there and close his eyes and says, all right, you're going to close your eyes and you're going to fall and we're going to catch you. And everyone lines up behind him and they're all waiting, and they said 1, 2, and he goes forward. And just, it was like, so there was a missing piece there, but I will say he acted on his faith. He trusted, right? Anyway, this is what I'm saying. Like, I think it's funny, but what's that? Well, it doesn't show that part. Of course, the video cuts off. I'll show you later. You'll enjoy it. Needless to say, all of that. The point of it is that faith. It's one thing to say all that you say I will do. It's another thing to step out, and it just shows that Naomi really does trust God. Yes, there's a loyalty here to Naomi that is amazing. She's such a good example of a friend. Again, her name means friend. But beyond that, she trusts the Lord, and she's willing to step out and trust. And this isn't just, I want to kind of lay this out for us, because this isn't just any trust. And let's see. Okay, here we go. Because she's risking safety. If you remember in the past chapter here, we looked at these things where Boaz said to her, have I not charged the young men not to touch you? Well, why did he say that? Because there was a danger in that, of her being a young woman there with these young men working in that type of area. And Naomi saying to her, it's good that you do this, otherwise you might be assaulted. So there was real danger to say, I want you to go out to this winnowing field at night, no less. Right? Go out to where all these men are staying the night, where they're working, and they're drinking and all these things, and I want you to just go there. And so Ruth says, I'll do it. I'll go. And she steps out to go do this, but she's risking her safety in this. She's risking her reputation, as a woman, because if she goes out and you go, what is this woman out here for? And I'll give an example, and this is a harder, anyway, passage to look at, but in Hosea, this is one example where God's talking to Israel and says, rejoice not, O Israel, exalt not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all the threshing floors. And so there's this idea that this was something that happened, that women would go out while the men were working and they would make their wages there. So for Ruth to step out and go as a single young woman to this place was risking her reputation. Now granted, she's a Moabite and already has that against her, as we talked about in Numbers 25, about how the Moabite women had come and seduced the men and led them into idolatry. So there's already a hit against her. And so to step out as a single woman at all, but as a Moabite woman, was really risking her reputation. She was risking rejection, because as she does this, there's the chance that Boaz will say no. That he'll say, no, I'm not going to do that for you. And if any of you have lived and tried, had any kind of romantic relationships or any of that, that there's a risk involved, and that doesn't feel good to be rejected, right? So it's not a small thing. It's a big thing for her to do that. And then she's risking her own comfort. And I'm going to pull back to some of these verses because we're kind of skipping ahead in my notes. Well, we'll go ahead. That's right. We'll stick with this. So she's putting herself in a vulnerable position. But then, so let's see what happens. So she steps out then, again in verse 7 here. And it says, when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and again, I said earlier that the men would get drunk. Some would. It doesn't say that. It doesn't insinuate that he had gotten drunk. And actually, because we think, he was drunk. He wasn't in his right mind. So that's why he was okay with it. Well, no, actually, what's indicated here in the way that it's talked about is just showing us that he was actually in his right mind. That, as one person said, he said that he was content and fulfilled at the end of his day's labor and his evening meal. So in other words, he had had a full day of work. He had enjoyed a meal. He was content. There was no worries on his mind. So if anything, he was actually in a good mindset right now. His heart was merry. And he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, which is interesting too, because why does it tell us that little bit? Like he could lay down anywhere, but even that just shows God's sovereignty in protecting their reputation, that he goes off into a discreet location where she can meet him. So we see God's sovereignty working in that. And then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And again, prescriptive, not descriptive. But, as she sat there, he was startled, turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And then he yells out and says, "Who are you?" And so again, obviously this is the middle of the night, right? He can't see anything, or he would recognize who she is. But again, this is the part where, remember, Naomi said, "Here's my plan up to this point. And then you just wait, and then after that, you'll know what to do." And Ruth goes a step further. She doesn't just go and present and say, "Okay, Boaz, will you take the initiative?" But she takes the initiative in this, which is very unique in this culture, that she would actually basically propose to him, that she's proposing to Boaz, because she's saying, "I am Ruth, your servant," which starts off with humility, right? Like, I'm your servant. She said that the whole way through. She understands who she is. She understands that this is grace that's going to be shown to her. But there's also a boldness in it. This comes like what we were talking about in the song, Barb, just coming to him in this way and trusting not just Boaz, but trusting God. And she says, "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And there's reference here, and I forgot to, or no, maybe I did. Let's see if I put them in here. I did. If you remember again in chapter 2, where Boaz says to her when she came to the field that belonged to him, he said, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So there's certainly a reference to that he's saying, "You've come under the Lord's wings," and she's saying, "Will you do this for me?" But also there's an idea that this is actually a covenant thing that would be done. In Ezekiel, God says this. It says, "When I passed by you again and saw you, and behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you, and covered your nakedness, and made my vow to you, and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord God, and you became mine." And so there's this idea that this, in that culture at least, and again, it's not well known, but there seems to be an idea that what she was saying to him essentially was, "Will you marry me? Will you covenant with me? Will you care for me?" And so we see that in Ezekiel. So again, there's humility in Ruth in asking him to do this, but there's also a boldness. And again, I think that Ruth was willing to ask and to risk this because she trusted in the providence of Yahweh, of Naomi's God, who had now become her God. So we have Naomi who has stepped out and sought rest for Ruth. We have Ruth that's taking a risk, and both of them doing it because of their trust for God and his providence. And so then we finally see that there is a redemption promised, that her risk wasn't for nothing. And if it had left off where we just left in those verses, that would be like my dad used to have us watch the old Batman shows, and we'd watch and they would get to a cliffhanger, and they would say, "Tune in next week," and he'd pull out the VHS, which we can talk about later if you guys don't know what that is. But he would pull out the VHS and he's like, "You have to wait till next week. I had to wait when I was younger. You're going to wait." And that would be where this would where this would end. Is it's like, "Who are you, Ruth?" And she says, "Will you do this for me?" And then it shuts off, and you're like, "Tune in, come back," But thankfully, it fills all the details in for us now that he does respond favorably, because in verse 10 he says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter, for you have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." And he says this last well, first of all, he says, "May you be blessed by Yahweh," again, indicating this is who you've really come to be under, whose wings you've come to be under. You've asked to be under my wings. You've asked me to put the blanket over you, but really you've come under God. May he bless you. But then he says this odd phrase, "You've made this last kindness greater than the first." Well, the first kindness was when she left Moab. And again, I don't know if I put this in here. Yes, here we go. When he references back, no, maybe not. Right here, yes. "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, how you left your father and your mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." So this was her first kindness, right? That she was giving up her past relationships. She was turning away from that. But her second kindness, he says, is that she doesn't just give up those past things, but that she is giving up essentially her future. That she has the option to marry somebody younger, somebody she chooses, to have her own future here in Israel. But she gives all of that up, again, for Naomi, so that Naomi can have her bloodline continue. She can have an heir. And of course, little does Ruth know, but that her choice won't just provide an heir for Naomi, but ultimately will provide the bloodline for the Messiah. But again, that we see the compassion of Boaz. It represents God. There's this interplay throughout this whole thing that she's coming to Boaz, and it's like Boaz is showing kindness, he's showing compassion, but ultimately he's representing God. He's showing the love and compassion of God. And he says to her, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you're a worthy woman." So all those fears, right, all the risks that she was taking of reputation, of safety, of provision, of comfort, of rejection, all those things, he's saying, don't fear. Don't fear those things. I'll make it right. I will do what you've asked. And again, this is representing God and his hesed. Boaz is representing that for us to see and for Ruth to see as well. And again, this is an interesting thing because we were talking on the way down here, and we'll get to this in a minute, but none of this talks about what Boaz looks like. It doesn't say he was, this tall man, dark hair, tall, dark, and handsome, the whole thing, whatever. Or that Ruth was beautiful, that he looked on her. It doesn't say any of those things for us. All it continually talks about is their worthiness of character, which is very interesting. And I will say, guys, that's descriptive, but you can take that as prescriptive. Look for the character of the person, right? It's someone who's worthy, someone who loves God and follows after them. Because Ruth, her character was known, right? She was a woman who worked hard. And again, as we talked about just a minute ago, who's willing to give up all those things for someone else. And let me see. I don't have... So when you talk about Ruth being a worthy woman, I would imagine that in your mind, one of the texts that you would go to is Proverbs 31. And it would be a great place to go, right? When it talks about, what kind of woman should we, should any of you young men be looking for? And I didn't put it in here, but I'm going to go ahead and turn to it and just read a little bit of it. Because Proverbs 31... He says, "An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands." And it goes on, and I won't read all of it, but just go back and read that later. Because what's really interesting is in the Hebrew canon, you would read Proverbs 31, where the king, Lemuel, his mother, is talking to him and saying, this is the type of woman that you should find. This is the wife you should find. And then you would turn that page, and the very next thing you would come to was the book of Ruth. Essentially saying, what kind of woman should you find? Here's the woman you should find. And in case you're still wondering, here's an example. Here's somebody who lived, and this is who you should follow. This is the example for you women who you should follow, for you men. This is what you should look for in a wife. So very interesting there. But he says that you are worthy. I will do what you ask because you're worthy. But all right, let me come here. Okay. So he promises redemption, right? He says, all that you've asked, I will do for you. And then he says this in verse 12. He says, "And now it's true, though, that I'm a redeemer, yet there's a redeemer nearer than I." And so there's something else to look at here, because he makes this promise to her of redemption. I'll be the redeemer. I will redeem you. But his promise is only good as two things. One, the circumstances surrounding his promise. And two, his character, the character of the person making the promise. And immediately we find that the circumstances don't actually allow for him to fulfill that, at least not right away. And again, like any true good love story, there's this climax. There's everything's good. Oh no, there's somebody else coming into the picture. It's going to mess it all up, right? And so there is somebody nearer than him, and we'll talk about that later. But we don't know his character at this point. She doesn't know. Ruth has taken this risk. She's gone to Boaz, and he said, don't worry, I'll make it right. But I need you to know that there is somebody else first. And we don't know his character. We don't know anything about him. We don't know if Naomi knew that there was another redeemer when she sent her on this mission. We don't know any of that. So there's the circumstance, but then there's also the character. Because he says, remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. Right? That's the way it should go. We'll trust God. We'll trust his sovereignty. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. And so we see Boaz's character as one who's worthy, one that she can trust. But there's something to point out here, because ultimately, again, Ruth is not, her trust isn't not primarily about Boaz's character, right? But it's in the character of God, who's sovereignly been bringing about her and Naomi's redemption all along. And again, that's this interplay, because the love story isn't ultimately about Ruth and Boaz. The love story really is ultimately about God's redeeming love for us, right? That he is for us. It's God's covenant love that's on display here. So this is one of those kind of, edge of your seat type of stories, because it's up and down and you're kind of waiting to see what happens. And unfortunately, chapter 3 ends off with us waiting, because the very last phrase he had said to her was to lie down until the morning, right? And so there's this idea, like, I'm going to do this. We'll find out what happens first, but now I want you to just rest. And I don't know about you guys, but that is a really hard time to rest. If I was Ruth, I'm probably not resting all night. I'm probably tossing and turning and wondering what's going to happen. Which again, there's a whole thing we can talk about. There's what's known as a theology of rest. That when we sleep at night, it is in itself an exercise of trusting God, right? Because, when you have all these things that have to get done and you're like, I have to get them done so I won't sleep tonight. Kind of shows like it's on me. I'm the one who has to make things happen. If we're willing to go to sleep, there is in it a recognition of God, you're sovereign. I'm going to go to sleep right now because you're God. I'm not. And I can rest in your sovereignty. That's a hard thing, right? It's another piece of following God in faith, is saying, I trust you enough that I'll go to sleep at night and just rest knowing that you're in control. But again, in God's goodness, in his grace, he doesn't just do that. He doesn't just say, you have to wait. But he also provides some clues that there is going to be provision. So there was redemption promised, and I didn't change this one, but it's not redemption promised again. The second one would be a reassuring provision. So you'll have to just know that it says that and write it in your own notes. A reassuring provision. Because in verse 14, he says this, so she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. So immediately, there's, again, speaking to their character, both of them sought to protect each other's reputation. She wakes up early while it's still dark so she can leave, so she doesn't have his reputation ruined by someone thinking that they've done something that they haven't. And he also says, let it not be known. I'm going to protect her reputation in this. So there's provision there in her reputation. But there's also provision of resources, because then he tells her, go ahead and bring the garment you're wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went into the city. So Isaiah asked if I brought the dog food bags from last week, and I didn't. So I asked him how much he weighed instead, which he's just a little over what the weight of 6 measures of barley is. 6 measures of barley is double what we had last week. So it'd be 2 dog food bags. Or if you remember Isaiah lifting those 5 gallons of water, it was extremely heavy. This would be 10 gallons worth in weight. Or somebody, one of you girls, can take Isaiah here and you can lift him over your shoulder, and that's the equivalent. Because this is what happened here. He said,
Say girl.
What's that?
You have to say girl.
Well, because Ruth is a girl who, yeah. So this again. So if we do know something about her, we don't know what she looked like, but we know she can carry 80 pounds of grain, which says something. She's right. Yeah, she's exercising at the Y like Miranda. So, but yeah, so it's 80 pounds. That's a lot, right? So again, it's just his grace being poured out again and again, right? And it's saying, listen, I'm going to do this for you. You have to wait and see, but I'm going to give you some reassurances, right? Here's 80 pounds of grain to show you that I'm promising this, that I am going to take care of you. And she takes it to Naomi, who says, how did you fare, my daughter? And then she told her all that the man had done. And actually, before I get too far here, again, this is just Naomi's heart again, right? Seeing her heart, seeing that she's trusting God and he's coming through for her, that he's reassuring not just Ruth, but Naomi. Because Boaz's commitment to Ruth isn't just to Ruth, but it's also to her mother-in-law. So there's a lot there. Yeah. So And again, I imagine Naomi was probably just waiting, right? Like waiting for Ruth to come, and then she's like, "Why it took you so long?" It's like, "Well, I'm carrying 80 pounds. That's what took me so long." But she comes and she tells her all that he's done, right? Not just for her, but for both of them. And there's something really interesting here because in this illustration here of her taking this garment and putting grain in it, there's two things here. And one's a little bit, I've only seen it from a couple of commentators, and it could be, but it says 6 measures of grain. Does anyone know what it would mean if there was 7 measures?
Full measure.
Yeah, it'd be full, right? Complete. Number 7. I was waiting for Isaac. It's like his favorite number. We talk about it all the time. But 7 would be complete, right? Again, 6 days, and the 7th was the completion. It was, complete in 7 days. And so there's this idea always that 7 is complete. And so interesting that he gives her 6. And again, I don't know. We won't stay on this too long. But it's the idea of this still isn't your full redemption, right? There's still more to come. There's still a completion to this. But there's also this idea that what she would have worn and where she would have put that grain would have been just like they would have used a garment to hold a baby. And again, is just filling up this emptiness that's been in them, which is referenced clearly in verse 17, because he says, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And if you catch this, the word empty is very significant, because way back in the first chapter, she said, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Right? And so she came back with this emptiness, not just emptiness of provision and grain, but ultimately the emptiness was losing her husband and her children, losing an heir, losing her family line. And so this was so significant to have this. You brought me back empty, and then to go, here's what I want you to go tell your mother-in-law. I'm giving you this grain. You're going to hold it just like you would hold a baby. You're going to bring this to your mother-in-law and say, you must not go back empty-handed. So what a neat thing, right? That God would say this through Boaz to Ruth and to Naomi. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to fill up all that was lacking. But again, it ends with a cliffhanger, right? And don't look down there. No. It ends with the cliffhanger because ultimately it says wait, right? Wait until you learn. Wait until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Waiting is probably the hardest part of life, maybe, just waiting. But certainly of faith. Walking by faith is waiting. God, how are you going to bring this about? Right? We say that, God, I trust you, but boy, it's been a long time. I've been waiting for this person, my family, to come to know you, and they haven't known you yet. I've been waiting for this healing to come to my body, and it hasn't come yet. This waiting is what is so hard. John Owen said this. He said, men love to trust God as they profess for what they have in their hands. So we'll trust God for what I can see right now, in possession, or what lies in an easy view. But place their desires afar off, carry their accomplishment behind the clouds out of their sight, interpose difficulties and perplexities, and their hearts are instantly sick. And God knows that about us, right? That it's easy for us to say, God, I trust you with what I can see right around the corner. Right? And so we kind of do everything we can when we're following God. Like, I'm going to step out in faith, but I need to see, this is really real right now. I'm going to step out in faith, but I need to see all these things. I need as many confirmations as possible. Right? I can trust you because I can see it. It's right there. It's a little ways away, but I can see it. So I trust you. But what about when it's not there? But I love that God is so gracious, and he knows that that's true of us. And he still gives us these reassurances that he's going to do what he's promised to do. So John Owen continues on and says, would you have the presence of God with you? Then learn to wait quietly for the salvation you expect from him. And so this waiting part is hard. But, I have to wait for Charlie. I have to wait for her. I can't do this. Anyway, waiting is hard. While the hardest part of walking by faith is trusting in the waiting, the best part of walking by faith is the trustworthiness of the one that we're waiting for. Right? And that's what we've seen in this story. Right? It's hard to wait. This part of waiting is hard. For her to go to sleep that night is hard. For her to go, okay, I'm going to make this right, but go home now and just wait and see how it turns out. That's hard. But the best part is the trustworthiness of the one who we're waiting for. That he's
that same guy?
No, this is just something I wrote down. So yeah, just this is what it takes, right? When we're walking by faith is to, yes, the waiting's hard, but the one we're waiting on is trustworthy. And that's what we're seeing again and again through this story of Ruth and Naomi. And that's what Boaz is showing us as an example of God and his love and his grace, is that he's faithful. And yes, the waiting's hard, but man, look at the one we're waiting on. Look at his character. He's faithful. So we can trust and we can wait. And this is really what it means to be a Christian, because as we experience redemption, there is this piece to it, which Philip Ryken says, God has already accomplished our redemption in Christ, but he has not yet fulfilled all the promises of his coming kingdom. Whereas there's already not yet peace to faith, always, right? That our salvation has been accomplished. That's done. We can trust it. So just as Boaz says to Ruth, I'm going to redeem you, but you got to wait for the fulfillment of it. That's us in our Christian walk. He's saved us. That's secure, but more so than Boaz's promise. Boaz's promise is dependent on circumstances that he's not in control of, and it's based on his character that, though worthy, is still someone who has a sin nature. But our promise of salvation and redemption is from God himself, who, as we talked before, is faithful in his very character. And so we can trust him. Thomas Schreiner, also talking about this idea, says this, that believers live in the interval between the already and the not yet. God's promises are already realized in Christ, but the present evil age still exists, so that believers must remain vigilant and keep putting their trust in the cross of Christ. Right? So again, we wait. He's redeemed us already. Right? That's the good news. We've already been promised redemption. We've already been promised salvation. But, as he goes on to say, salvation then has an already but not yet character. Believers have already been saved, and yet they await the completion of their salvation on the final day. Or, somebody else has quoted in the book of Psalms, David says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And then he says, wait for the Lord, be strong, let your heart take courage, and wait for the Lord. So we, like Ruth and Naomi, have a Redeemer who's promised to make all things new for us. The difference for us is that our Redeemer is Christ, God with us, and he's accomplished a sure redemption for us by his own blood. The similarity, however, is that we are also waiting for the completion of that redemption, when he will come and make, as someone has said, all sad things untrue, and we will dwell with him for all eternity, sharing in the eternal love of the triune God. And that's what this is about. As we said, this is his love story. Ian Duguid, who is one of the ones who wrote the study guide we've been going through, says this. There's a love story that needs to be told to the wandering sheep who are still out in the cold. There are people who do not yet know that God has loved them so much. So how can we keep quiet? How can we not speak of the glories of this God who has loved us so much, whatever the risk? We must look for and make opportunities to speak of this love of God. Having been loved so much, we must surely declare the praises of the Redeemer who saved us through his blood. So this is what the story is about so far. It's not, again, ultimately a love story about Boaz and Ruth, although we'll find out more about that as it closes next week. Ultimately, this is a story about God's sovereign, redeeming love for us. And so afterward, I'm going to have some things up on the slide that'll be some questions for you after we sing today. And I'd like you to write those things down and think through that this week. And some of those things they go with the points here, that we can have confidence in God's sovereignty. We can follow him because he's sovereign. That we can risk because we know that God is for us. And that means risking telling others about him, seeing others come to redemption. That's what Ruth was doing, right? She stepped out and risked all those things, not just for her own redemption, but for the redemption of Naomi. And so we're called to do the same, to step out and risk for the redemption of others, that they would come to know the great Redeemer. And then in our own redemption, we're called to wait patiently, which again is hard, right? To wait on him. And in that waiting, though, because God is gracious, he does give us all these assurances. And so there are things in our lives all the time that kind of point to this, that point to the fact that God is faithful. And we need to be looking to those things to remind us, because the waiting is hard. But God is faithful. So let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll continue to worship through song. Father, we thank you for your faithfulness. We thank you for your hesed, for your covenant love that doesn't give up on us, doesn't let us go. That you pursue us when we've wandered off from you. You've pursued us when we were far off, when we were enemies of you and would have never sought you on our own. Father, like Ruth, we certainly would come to you like her, like the prodigal, and say, we're not worthy. We'd just be fine being your servant. And yet, Father, you in your great love and your grace for us, love us much more than just as a servant. As Christ said, that you call us friend, that you as our Father have adopted us, that you've made us your own, that through Christ we have been promised a redemption, the great marriage supper of the Lamb, that one day we'll be there before you and all things will be made right, all sad things will come untrue. But Father, would you be with us in the waiting? That we would trust you, that we would genuinely trust you, that we would know that you are sovereign, that you are working for our good. And Father, also, would you help us then in that knowledge of your great love for us to have boldness to go and tell others, to risk whatever it takes to let others know that you are a God who loves them, a God who is willing and able to redeem them from the dark places that they're in. Father, would you use us to share this great love story of your sovereign redeeming love? We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.